Hi guys, this is an interesting little example that I wanted to share with you. This is a 30-minute rapid game that I just played. It didn't really conclude. My opponent abandoned the game. But what I think was really fascinating about it and useful to learn is to look at the move choices that were made in the game and how they contributed or did not contribute to piece development and control of the board. So we'll walk through it as far as the game got. We only got up to move 21. I am playing with the white pieces and I open with e4. My opponent responds, so my opponent's rated 1185 here, responds with c5, so the Sicilian defense, and what I've been enjoying playing this week is the Smith-Morra gambit. So that's d4, inviting black to capture with the c-pawn, which black does. The next move then is c3, inviting that pawn to move again, which, like the Danish, allows me to get pieces out quickly into the game and start looking at black's kingside. Black, however, declines the gambit at this point and instead plays e5. Okay, so far so normal. So I decide to go ahead and capture the d-pawn with my c-pawn, because when you look here, when black recaptures, black now has these doubled isolated pawns on the d-file. So I figure that that's no bad thing for me. I can't see black hanging on to that pawn on d4 for the rest of the game. So I've got an option here to capture with the queen, but I decide against capturing with the queen. Why? Because in quite a few games recently, my opponent has brought a queen out too early. And so if I capture there with a queen, then we've got, the knight can come straight out to c6. And then what can happen is when the queen's out in the middle of the board, that can give the opposing player the opportunity to develop pieces while kicking the queen around the board. And then what you end up with is the queen might end up going back to a safe position, and your opponent has developed all their pieces and you haven't. Okay, so development is really a theme at the moment, and this is exactly what starts to happen. Black brings out his queen. I develop my knight, so I've now got two pieces attacking the pawn on d4. Black brings out a knight, so he's got two defenders on d4. And you see, all these moves, I'm looking for how can I develop, okay? Knight comes out to develop. Knight comes out, bishop comes out, attacking the queen. Right? That is a weakness, because the queen's come out into the board. Queen moves. Now I move my queen out to b3. And what we're doing here is we're looking at the f7 pawn. This is that classic barrage that you can get with the Danish gambit or the Smith-Morra. So I thought I'd pull that one out. So what this is doing is little jabs. So we've made the queen move. Now we're attacking a different part of the board. Black plays a decent move here. Comes in with the queen to the protected square b4. And black is now able to force an exchange of queens. So I've got some options here. The obvious thing here would be to accept the exchange and capture the queen on b4, but then I'm thinking that would bring black's knight in here to b4, which is then just one jump away from c2, and I'm worried that my rook can't actually move right now, so I really don't want that knight to come up the board into my half of the board. So what other options are there? I can't castle out of check, that's illegal. I can block this square with either my b knight or my knight on f3. So with the idea of, can you develop while doing something else? Can you make one move do two things? I develop with my knight on b1. fully expecting black to exchange queens. Black does exchange queens. Now I've got three options again. I can capture with a knight on d2, I can capture with the pawn on a2, but that would give me doubled and isolated pawns on the b file, or I can capture with the bishop. I decide to capture with the knight because that will create another problem for black. Now we've got two pieces looking at the d4 pawn. Black comes in with a check, and I block with the knight. So you see my knights are working as a team here. So that that threat has been thwarted for now. You can see now I have all four of my minor pieces are now out in the board, right? Black only has two minor pieces out in the board, and all of these pieces on the back rank here are really not playing any part in the game. Okay, my pieces are in the game, and that's because I've made developing moves, and I've used my moves to develop while achieving other things as well, while putting pressure on, while chasing the queen, etc., while blocking a check. I think this is a poor move on black's part. It's a pawn move, and it's really unnecessary. I mean, that is not a threat. I can move my bishop, to a couple of places quite comfortably. It's not making the position of my bishop any worse. It can still attack what it wants to attack. And also the other thing that you need to bear in mind is black. If we look at black's pawn structure, the C file is completely open. There are no pawns on the C file at all. So there's absolutely no way that black should be thinking about castling long and putting his queen on c8, which means if black wants to get his king to safety, he should be thinking about getting the knight on g8 out of the way and then castling kingside. But what's he doing here? He's pushing his h-pawn, which is weakening that kingside for no reason. I retreat my bishop in the hope that black will follow up with his feeble threat and play g5, which indeed he does, and I just stick my bishop back on g3. So now, looking at black's pawn structure, is it's really weak. It's very bad indeed, and if he goes ahead and castles kingside, he's going to have trouble protecting his king because these advanced pawns here are going to be very weak. Black finally decides to move his knight out into the board. I castle. Black castles. You can see the difference in protection that these kings have. I decide it's time to kick the bishop away. I know that if the bishop goes to a5, I will capture with a knight. Okay, look at the position of my knights. So right now my knights are over in this bottom left side of the board, and black's king is right in the other corner. So I'm thinking my knights right now are not particularly strong, not particularly useful. While my king was in the middle of the board, they were doing a job defending the king. The king is now castled, so these knights are relatively weak pieces. So I would welcome the opportunity to exchange my knights for either of black's bishops. In particular, the board is quite open. It's a good game for bishops. And black obliges me here by capturing my knight. And I honestly don't know why he would have done that, quite honestly. I recapture with my knight. So now I have the bishop pair. And again, look at the board. Black has just thrown away a developed piece in return for a weaker piece, quite honestly. So now the only pieces that black has in the board now are two knights, and they're up on the 6th rank, and they're not really... There's no threat at all right now. Whereas I've got a nice bishop there on c4 that's looking at black's king. I've got another bishop controlling another diagonal across the board. In terms of numbers of squares that I'm controlling, I've definitely got the upper hand at this point. Also, I've completed development. My rooks are connected. So, black's rook on a8 is not part of the game at the moment at all. So overall, it's a far more favourable situation for white at this time. Black decides to come in, and again, this is one of those like weak kind of attacks. So he's poking at my bishop, but you know, what's going to happen? The bishop's just going to move out of the way. So I decide to retreat all the way back to a2. So I'm controlling now these squares from that knight. So that knight really only has one decent place to go back to, and I'm keeping my bishop here on this nice diagonal looking at black's king, which means that this pawn is permanently pinned as long as that bishop is there and the king is there. Black pushes d4 to d3, not quite sure why. I play b4 to kick the knight back. Knight goes back to the 6th rank. It's well away from my king, well away from causing me any problems. I bring my bishop out to c4 to attack the pawn that's been pushed to d3. This is another weak move. What should black be doing at this point? Black should be thinking about get this bishop out into the board where it can have some attacking chances and get these knights further up the board. I mean, that, you know, knight to e5 is a perfectly, no, it isn't, because it will be taken by the bishop, but knight can come up out there to d4. You know, it can go there and fork the king. You know, a6 at this point in the game is just not a strong move. I go ahead and capture the pawn. Why not? Also means that the bishop is defending e4, so that's now doubly defended. And then I figure I have the upper hand, and I know that black's advanced pawns on the G and H files are vulnerabilities, so let's go in for the attack. I would be very, very happy if black would be to capture there. That would be absolutely fine for me, because I can then recapture with the rook or with the bishop, probably the bishop. And this is the point where black abandoned the game. He'd used 13 minutes of his 30 minutes. I'd only used 4 by this point because the moves they really were just flowing a lot more naturally. So let's just whiz back to the beginning of the game again and just do another quick review. Okay, and what are we looking for? We're looking for moves that develop pieces. Okay, so fairly standard opening now. Okay, piece comes out, queen comes out, right? There's a reason why we say don't move your queen too early in the game. What's this queen doing? You know, what's the point of this attack? Is black thinking about bringing the bishop out and maybe going for f2? I don't know, but it's, you know, that response completely refutes any idea of attack. So I'm protecting f2, I'm developing a piece, I'm attacking d4, right? And this is one of the keys to playing better chess. It really is, because what we're doing is that we are layering up the things that we are doing in the game, right? So this has a defensive capacity, you know, protecting f2. It's got an offensive capacity, protecting d4. Sorry, attacking d4, and it's developing a piece into the board. So this is now a knight that is looking at lots of squares on the board, right? I've got all of those attacking squares, and I'm defending squares behind it as well. So very, very useful move. Black develops a piece, that's good. I then take advantage of the fact that black has prematurely brought his queen out into the game, so the queen has to move, right? That's losing a tempo. I bring my queen out, so further development. Instead of going for the exchange and allowing black's pieces to come up the board, I decide that I'm going to block the check instead. Black comes in with another half-hearted attack, and which I block. Yeah, so I've now got 4 minor pieces in the board. Black only has 2. This is not, you know, this is not a developing move at all. Black is really wasting time with this, and all he's done is weakened his pawns, right? Then he finally decides to bring his knight out into the game. I castle, he castles. I'm still ahead in development. black makes a bad choice and exchanges a good piece for a weaker piece. See, you can see how your black isn't making any progress up the board, right? And that was where the game was lost. So, you know, the real takeaway from this is, if you can achieve what you need to achieve on your next move and develop a piece at the same time, then you are having more play in the game than your opponent potentially. Okay, so yeah, I just thought this was interesting and wanted to share. I hope you've got something from it as well. I'll see you next time.